Hello, my name is Tori Street, and this is my PowerPoint presentation for technology applications for educational leaders. I'm doing this presentation on the effect of podcast lectures on nursing students' knowledge, retention, and application by Karen S. Abate. Mobile learning, or M-learning, is the most recent generation of computer-enhanced education, and it is regarded in many nursing programs as effective, flexible, and innovative. As our program that we're in is an all-online program that requires us to use a lot of technology and interaction through various interfaces such as eLearns with the discussion boards, YouTube, video simulcast, all sorts of things. This is an article that definitely can be related to what we're working in now and how technology is affecting education. The purpose of this study was to evaluate the effectiveness of common designs of academic podcasts in promotion of knowledge retention and application among nursing students. So the first thing that this study did was look at the literature reviews on podcasts and different types of e-learning systems. So what they found was that the current higher education use of podcasts span many possibilities. Whether it be replacing traditional classroom lecture, augmenting traditional lecture before a face-to-face session, just providing information for absent students or to go and review after the class has happened, or even just using that as the sole means of communication. Lots of researchers have demonstrated the value of podcasts for review and exam preparation, and also found that in the nursing realm, it was an important resource to review subject matter, reinforce material, clarify content, and facilitate note-taking. Other studies showed that students overwhelmingly prefer traditional lectures to podcasts. They like having the podcast as a resource, but wouldn't necessarily want to substitute it for an actual class session. So what this study wanted to look at really was, how should these podcasts be used? Should they be the only means for the students to learn, or should it be used in conjunction with a classroom lecture, or should there be no podcast and traditional lecture be the only option? This study used a convenient sample of 35 female undergraduate nursing students attending a private four-year women's college in a major city. These students were undergraduate, as I said. Some were part-time and some were full-time. 9% were 19 years old, 60% were between 20 and 25 years old, 20% were between 26 and 30 years old, and nearly 9% were between 31 and 35 years old. Only 2% were 40 years or older. Everyone was enrolled in an accredited BS nursing program, and as I said, some were full-time, 80%, and the rest were part-time students. So in this study, the participants were randomly assigned to one of three groups. The traditional lecture group, which was a classroom lecture, an unsegmented podcast lecture, or a segmented podcast lecture. After these were assigned and the classes was taken, questionnaires were given to the two podcast groups, and an examination of prior podcast listening habits found that 66.7% of all podcast group participants had never before listened to academic podcasts. The traditional lecture was roughly 90 minutes long. The nonstop podcast lecture was just over 57 minutes long, and the segmented podcast lecture was just over 51 minutes long and consisted of 3 sections. Cross-tabulations comparing the demographic characteristics of participants in all groups were done to check that random assignment was successful in creating groups with similar backgrounds. The first comparison was conducted on participants' age. 90.9% of unsegmented podcast participants were 20 to 25 years old, while just 50% of the traditional lecture group and 41.7% of the segmented podcast group were in that age range. In addition, 41.7% of the traditional lecture group was 26 to 30 years old, while none of the unsegmented podcast group and 16.7% of the segmented podcast group were. Findings also demonstrated that 90.9% of the unsegmented podcast group had no prior knowledge of the lecture content, while 83.3% of the segmented podcast group and 66.7% of the traditional lecture group did. Questionnaires were also issued about the examination of podcast listening habits. Findings demonstrated that 90.5% of podcast participants listened to the podcast 1 or 2 times. One participant was unable to listen, and one participant listened 3 to 5 times. Participants in the 2 podcast groups were asked to respond to statements on their retention and application of key concepts. So if they strongly disagreed or agreed to questions like, to what degree do you agree with the following statement? The use of this academic audio podcast helped me remember a pharmacology concept. Those results showed that no participant strongly disagreed with that statement, and the majority of participants, 61.9%, just put agreed for most of their results. The students also took multiple choice quizzes to address retention of the information. And these showed that the segmented podcast group had the highest mean score, followed by the traditional lecture group and the unsegmented lecture group. So all in all, what does this study tell us? It has identified that the retention and application of lecture content was supported by intentional podcast segmentation. The findings suggested that students perceived podcasts as having enhanced their retention and application of nursing pharmacology content. In fact, findings indicated that segmented podcast lectures supported a trend towards deeper understanding of lecture content as demonstrated by improved retention and application scores. So when used in conjunction with a traditional lecture, the podcast can be a very positive thing and a way for students to review and check up on and their knowledge, as well as prepare for the upcoming class and knowing the content that's going to be talked about in class. However, a downside to having a solely podcast course is, especially for undergraduate students, there's not really any accountability to listen to the course. Whereas if you're having to go to a class, most likely the professor is taking the role, and if you're not showing up to class, that affects your grade. Whereas if you're just listening to a podcast and it's not being tracked if you've watched it or not, you kind of get the feeling like, well, if I don't watch it, it's not a big deal. And so especially with undergraduate students, that can play into a lot of their learning potential. When we think about using podcast-only education, it could better be used for graduate and professional students. I know personally a lot of the students over at the medical school where I work, in several of their courses, the professors use a majority of YouTube videos for the students to watch as a kind of a review and an introduction to the material. And I know that the students really enjoy having access to those at all times. They've uploaded them to YouTube, so the students are able to go in and watch and rewatch and watch with their study group and review and go over those to prepare for their testing, and that's something that they really like to have access to. All in all, I think that this study supported kind of my original views that I think podcasts are better served as a supplement to traditional learning rather than just the sole means of teaching. That way students are able to review after the class is over or prepare for the upcoming classes kind of on their own time and when they want, but they are still being held accountable for the information by having to be somewhere or knowing that their teachers are going to be able to see if they listen to it, etc. So thanks for listening, and have a great day.